Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Koenig and this is a quick video tutorial on integers and using the absolute value. Let's jump in. Let's take a minute to regroup on what absolute value means. So when you see an absolute value problem, it looks like these three examples before you. So you'll see there are these bars that we call absolute value bars, and those are asking you for a distance. Specifically with absolute value, we're looking for the distance from whatever number is inside those bars to 0 on a number line. How many steps, how many hops, how many units from that number to 0? So for example, from -5 to 0 would take 5 hops on a number line, so the absolute value is 5. +8 to 0 is the exact same idea. You're still looking for the distance, you're still looking to 0. In this case, you're going to the left-hand side because 0 is smaller than 8. The absolute value of 8 is 8. Now, obviously, once you kind of get a feel for that, it's a little easier to do absolute value problems. So here we have the absolute value of -37. I can imagine that if I was at -37 on a number line, I would go 37 spaces to the right, and that would land me at 0 on the number line. So essentially, the absolute value is just a measure of distance. It's how far away from 0 is that number on the number line. What's interesting is that opposite values have the same absolute value. So for example, -5 had an absolute value of +5, but if I asked you for the absolute value of 5, I'm still moving from 5 to 0, just +5 this time. The absolute value of +5 is still 5 because the distance from either +5 or -5 to 0 is 5. Similarly, if I asked you for the absolute value of -8, to go from -8 to 0 on the number line, you would still travel 8 spaces. So you'll notice that these opposite values have the same absolute value. Now, while we see absolute value early on in our first understanding of absolute value as a measurement of distance from some number to 0, absolute value is really an operation that we can use, kind of like addition is an operation that we can use. Subtraction, multiplication, division, and absolute value. Those are all operations that we can use on numbers. Absolute value can also help us find the distance between two numbers on a number line. So let's start with one, and we'll talk about how to find the distance between two numbers, and then we'll apply the idea of absolute value to it. So for example, here it asks me for the distance between -7 and 8. So if I want to know the distance between two numbers, I'm really looking for how many hops would it take me, how many steps or how many units would it take me to get from -7 to 8 or vice versa. If I go from -7 to 8, I'm going to hop 7 times to get to 0. So I'm going to write 7. And then from 0, I'm going to hop 8 more times to get to 8, which tells me that I have to go 7 hops and 8 hops. So the total distance between -7 and 8 is 15, and we'll say in this case, units. Here's another, a little bit different. We're finding now the distance between two negative numbers. So this time I want to find the distance from -3 to -10 or vice versa, -10 to -3. So if I'm going from -3 to -10, I'm going to the left-hand side. I can look for my hops or my units to get from one to the other. In this case, I see that I need to travel 7 spaces, so the distance is equal to 7 units. The problem with using a number line and counting the number of hops between one thing and another thing is that eventually you'll get a question like this. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to draw a number line that goes from -27 to 45. That's going to be a really long number line, take a lot of my time, and there's a more efficient way to answer this question. Absolute value can help us with this. Now, to find the difference between two numbers is similar to finding the distance between two numbers. So difference and distance are similar mathematically. If I want to know the distance between these two numbers, I can subtract them, and then the absolute value will represent the distance. So, for example, I want to subtract these, -27 minus 45. And I know with my integer operation rules that I can actually rewrite a problem like that as -27 plus -45 to find the difference between these. Now, when I'm adding two negatives, I just add them like I would any other numbers. So I need to know what 27 and 45 equal when added. And I get a total of 72. In this case, I'm adding two negative numbers, so I get a total of negative 72. Now, distance is a measurement that is always positive, and that's really something to keep track of. When we talk about distance, we say we're going to drive 10 miles to go to the store. We never say we're going to go negative 10 miles. It doesn't matter if we're going left, right, north, south. We always talk about distance in a positive way, and that's where the absolute value comes in. Once I find the difference, once I subtract them, I can use the absolute value of my answer, and that will represent the total distance. In this case, the total distance is 72 units. We always report that distance as a positive number. That's why the absolute value is useful in this problem. Let's take a look at one more. Now that we kind of know the trick, we know how to subtract to find the difference and then use the absolute value to find the distance. So here I want the distance between negative 63 and negative 115. In order to find that distance, the most efficient way, I will subtract negative 63 minus negative 115. Now you'll want to make sure you keep track of the fact that this is negative 115, negative 63, and I still need a minus sign in between. That's a lot of negatives. It's easy to get lost along the way. Now let's solve this problem. I know from my integer rules that I can change this to an addition problem if I use the additive inverse of negative 115, which is positive 115. So what I have here is negative 63 plus 115. In order to add two things that are different, one positive, one negative, I'm really doing subtraction. That's how we solve this problem. So I'll go ahead and subtract, and I see that I get 52. And the absolute value is what gives me the total distance. In this case, the absolute value of a positive number is still that same positive number. So the distance is 52 units. I hope that helps you better understand how absolute value can be useful in finding the difference between two numbers or the distance between two numbers. Absolute value represents a number's distance from zero, but it's also a tool that can get us to the distance between two values. So you can think of that as a subtraction problem, and then once you subtract A minus B or B minus A, whatever two numbers you're using, the absolute value will give you the distance. It's also important to note that a number line is still useful in this problem, and sometimes even visualizing a number line can be really helpful to know if you're going to go past zero. Like for example, from our problem where we went from negative 7 to 0 and 0 to 8, I knew I was going to end up adding 7 and 8. Whereas if I had two negatives instead in the problem with negative 3 and 10, I wasn't crossing 0. So I knew I wasn't going to end up adding negative 3 and 10 to get to my solution. So a number line's still useful, but the most efficient way is to subtract the two values and use the absolute value. I hope that helps you better understand using absolute value. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.